My name's Peter Stonham. I'm the editorial director of Landor Links LTT. This is the 7th in our Friday afternoon discussion get-togethers. I don't know whether you've noticed as readers, but we've just passed a major anniversary of local transport today, 800 issues, 31 years. And there's been a bit of coverage in the magazine. It's also up on our Transport Extra website of what's taken place since we began in 1989. And in preparing that, I found it quite dramatically mortifying to see how many things have come into our world we had no inkling of when we started. Most people now take them all for granted. I did a long list, everything from general use of the internet to yes, card payments and everything like that. And I thought, well, isn't it about time we cast our minds forward and tried to guess what those things will be going 30 years forward from now? So today's discussion is based upon the principle of speculative futurology. There's no science here, I don't think. Well, there's some science in it, but it won't be scientific what we come up with. But I do think it's important that we know as a sector that we're probably going to get loads of stuff wrong because we can't think about the unknowns. And well, we can think about them, but we can't know the unknowns. So we've got to plan in an environment of what should we say, unpredictability. So I've put myself on the panel this week, which I have the right to do, and I'm going to say a few things about how I see the world evolving. But we've got 5 excellent contributors as well, and I'm going to hand over now to LTT editor Andrew Forster, who will introduce the speakers and chair the discussion.
As I was saying, the title's Calling the Future, What Are the Surprises in Store That We're Not Even Planning For Yet? And my opening gambit was going to be the Donald Rumsfeld quote about known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And I thought this might be a session all about unknown unknowns. And I thought, how can we have an hour and a half discussion about such things we don't know? Hopefully we'll have some substance of interest to chew over. Just one thought I had about what Peter was saying about the issue 800 list with all the innovations and new developments that have happened in transport over the 30 years of LTT. I just was wondering if we'd drawn up a list of things which have stopped, no longer exist over the last 30 years, whether it would be anywhere near as long. I suspect it wouldn't be. I get the feeling that we've got lots of, all these innovations are actually added to what the existing layers of activity. Certainly that's the impression I've had of editing the magazine, is that we have the number of topics and developments that we cover has grown exponentially, and there's been no reduction in activities on things we've always covered. Just very quickly, I guess there'll be some thoughts about COVID-19 and how it might affect the future. Just 2 very quick snippets from me on that. I was reading this morning about Solent Transport, which is one of the government's future transport zones. Clearly they had a big program of activity which they drew up before COVID-19. And because of COVID-19, they're actually revising their innovation plans for the next 3 years quite significantly to capitalize on certain issues and saying some of the issues we were going to innovate on, we're not going to innovate on now because of COVID-19. So, short-term impacts, even on innovation. So look, I think let's go over now to the presentations. Each of the speakers is going to be speaking for about 5 minutes. And I think we're starting with Christine Barrow of Social Research Associates. So over to you, Christine.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start my presentation by thanking Peter for all these years of innovation and, if you like, insights. He's one of the few people that have supported social science in a wider remit in understanding transport. And I owe a lot to him for my own career for that support. So what I've put up on the screen at the moment is a project which took place 20 years ago and was commissioned by the Highways Agency. And I think the important thing about that was that the people that took part in this visioning exercise were not just transport people, they were social scientists, they were religious people, business, health, and I think they came up with some really good 12 scenarios. But what I've done here is the bits that I've highlighted in yellow are the scenarios and the visions which really never happened. And really, I want to sort of talk about why that might be, why they didn't happen. I think it's still a very valid document, by the way, and I've put a link to it at the end of my presentation. So just by way of an example of how, if you like, social scientists and transport people can be friends, if we look at family structures over the last years, we had work on nuclear families, we've had work on extended families in the East End. We then went on to the beanpole family, and all these family structures had transport implications of how many cars people had, where they lived, how they interacted. The work I'm doing at the moment is about looking at change, which fits this seminar, and the fastest growing household types in the UK are actually multi-generational families, up 75% over the last 10 years, and people living as singles, again, up. And I'm getting a lot of data from that. And I think the thing that Peter Warman will be saying in a minute is that we have got loads and loads of data now in real time, which is great. But what we don't know always just from data is the why of the what, if you like. And I think that's important where social scientists come in and work with transport people for better understanding. So the slides contain, which I take will be circulated afterwards, why these particular trends are taking place. And I'm working with some big developers on looking at those trends and how that might pan out in relation to planning and transport. So I won't go into that now, but I think there are reasons for that. I think the point I'm putting this up is that some of the reasons are not data driven. They are to do with people's attitudes, people's culture, people's beliefs and perceptions. So what are the implications of transport? I think we're at a unique tipping point in transport policy. And one thing we have learned from COVID and some other things we've spoken about is that people can change much faster than we thought. We are very adaptable as a society, much more than we ever thought. We do have the data. We need to know the why of the what. So I think we can all agree predict and provide is obsolete, which makes this seminar particularly relevant, and that the transport industry can work with other disciplines to plan and provide. So decision makers have to have confidence that we know what we're doing in the future and that they won't be scoring own goals. So my conclusion really is that this is a great time for us. There are huge opportunities for transport. We've learned from lockdown, and I'm not going to go through all these either, but I want to just pick two things out here, particularly opportunities for mobility as a service. I think that there's huge potential here. If you imagine a large family all living together or a group of old people all living as a commune, their transport needs are going to be very multivariate. We'll have the data to understand that and we'll have the capacity to offer them deals. So I don't think we need third parties there. And then the most important thing, I think, are enabling policies about how we can use these visions and the data and build in resilience. So just to pick out a few here too, land use planning, we've been banging on about this for so long, haven't we? Perhaps even before LTT started, about the need for join-up thinking here. And need for more flexibility in planning. I noticed that the Prime Minister has recently noticed some more flexible regimes here. That will enable people to do their own thing, to build and so on. I've got a picture here of what Lewisham Council are doing by way of modular household, and another building there by William Sellers together again in Lewisham, looking at internal divisions of housing, of where it can flexibly meet more family needs. So if we enable people to live in different ways, then they will also have transport needs. So I think that that is my conclusion to set the scene, if you like, on all this. Social scientists and transport people can and must be friends. And I'm delighted, again, going back to Peter, of the direction he's saying that LTT is going in, which I think is exactly this direction. And I think it's such an exciting time to be involved in transport. And I'm telling all the young people I lecture to, exciting careers ahead. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Christine. That's a great start. Just to remind people, if you've got any questions or points you want to raise or discuss, then please use the chat facility at the bottom of the screen to get them on record, and I'll keep an eye on that, and we can take that when the speakers finish. Let's go to the next speaker. I'm going to go to Peter Warman, who's a freelance transport planner. Peter, over to you.
Sorry, I'm here. I just want to take the other screen down so I can share my screen.
Okay, I think Tom is doing that.
Okay.
You okay?
Yeah. Is that okay? Am I being received?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, just to follow on from Chris's talk, obviously the conclusion from there is that if we knew the answers, there would no longer be surprises. And we can all make our guesses, but how do you arrive at these answers? I think a useful start is to identify what parts of the future transport systems are stable and will not change. If we go from there, taking on again some of Chris's points, you can understand the future better by observing existing travel behavior. You know, what do people like doing? What's frustrating, boring, exciting, disturbing? These are useful guides to how the public is likely to behave in changing circumstances. From that, I understand that technology may facilitate change, but changes in human behavior are stimulated by our own aspirations and our fears. Let me illustrate this going back to 1971. I spent the days looking at bus passengers, waiting for buses, and trying to see what their reactions would be if we introduced a countdown indicator. As you know, some 40 years later, the concept was applied at 2,000 stops across London, with the public being able to access on smartphones, and the technology was used to manage the whole bus network in real time. So the example was that the concept was tested first by observing behavior, and having proved its worth, eventually the technology arrived to make it possible. Over the years, we've learned many lessons about predicting transport futures and then seeing what actually happens. In '72, I was part of a team looking at the transport, the urban environment, telecommunications. The post office asked us to look forward 30 years. Although that's a long time ago, I think the approach we used possibly has relevance today, although our present day tools are far superior to do this kind of project. As today, as then, we have to first of all understand the present conditions of transport, the environment, and patterns of movement. We have to also understand what were the forces leading to change, of which Chris has already given some examples for today. And then from that, what are the implications for transport, telecoms, and land use? What we've got to move towards is testing how adaptable and resilient the networks are and the environments to such changes. If we move on to the new tools, it's impossible in this introduction to explain some of these new tools, but they're really very powerful. I would advise you to look at Robin North's work in immense simulations. He's done a very interesting 20-minute talk on this. It's on their website and there's details here. But these are very much new tools for fleet management, for infrastructure operations, and for regional transport planning and they're very powerful. Using these tools, we can describe how changes are likely to occur in different political scenarios. We can then test these and the resilience of our existing networks and environments to these changes. But the new tools we have allow us to see these in virtual reality, how areas are likely to evolve, how travel behavior changes, and what issues are to be addressed. The other thing that I've always been concerned about, often we make plans and they have no relevance when we actually go around to actually doing it. But with these new tools, there's probably a chance of not only planning our futures, but using the same systems to deliver the changes, manage the operations, and eventually look forward to maintenance as well. So this is summarized as a sort of simulations of a service. And I feel these will be the modular tools that we use in the future, in fact, are even coming in today. And this is making use of the many data sets, the CCTV, virtual simulation models that we have, to look at how changes are occurring. The other great thing is that this testing doesn't have to take years. It can actually happen over a few hours or a few days, which is also very important. Like Chris, I've got some ideas of some of the scenarios we ought to be testing. I'm sure all of you can think of many more. But what I want to emphasize is that planning is all about looking at resilience and the weaknesses in our networks to test in advance how they're going to react. So going back to today, well, again, as Chris mentioned, British society has demonstrated it can adapt very quickly. And also, quite interestingly, the government chose to show us travel data to show us what happened on a daily basis. But all this tended to show us is how vulnerable we are and to these changes and how it devastates our economy. I think a more resilient society anticipates and understands vulnerabilities and tries to guard against them, particularly against sudden changes. What I'm suggesting in this brief introduction that we actually do have the tools to do this virtually. And in times of economic stress, using these new tools to get better use of our existing networks, manage peaks, introduce temporary measures, rather than relying on building new infrastructure that we know takes years. Just as a last example, the London Olympics, they were looking at simulations 5 years before the event took place. And it was this preparation and planning that proved so effective on the few weeks when the Olympics had to change the way London operated. Anyway, I hope that gives you an insight to how I see the future of planning for surprises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now another Peter, Peter Stonham, who is Chairman and Editorial Director of Local Transport Today.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Am I on? I should be on. I'm just putting up my screen share. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me, Andrew?
Yes.
Good. I'm starting with a slightly different perspective. I'd probably best describe it as a way of saying that the human race is rather unpredictable and weird. We tend to do logical stuff in our planning worlds and our technology worlds, but human beings are not always doing what we expect. So I'm just exploring two hypotheses here about human nature and human behavior. My first point is that I don't think we can start with the principle of logic and predictability in people's behavior, because it's to do with their mental processes, both individually and collectively. And I'd say there's plenty of evidence that that is not stable and it's not predictable, and that affects everything we're talking about. So just as the current example, I mean, if we take some of the drivers of behavior and discussion, and I only went for the 4 Ds here, but they're pretty clear that at the moment there's a lot of conversation about what is democracy work. There's huge interest in disease and disaster, both in terms of COVID and other man-made and natural phenomenon. Plagues of locusts have come back on the radar. There's a huge importance of demographics, both in terms of numbers and movement of people and ethnic and family structures. And then there's an awful lot of disorder, whether we treat that as being protest or just general chaos in certain situations of governance breaking down. If you take those, and there's probably quite a longer list we could put up there, how they play out together is what determines the kind of society we're living in and how people live and behave. And that in turn decides how governments and powerful interests respond. And that's a very complex web of pressures and influences. The core point, I think, is that expectations and beliefs are pretty important in shaping behaviour, not facts. And they change over time. And I think at the moment, ever more rapidly and unpredictably. At the moment, as I say, there are some significant factors that are determining politics and behavioural choices. These are just a few random ones. It's talked about a lot. People have a greater sense of entitlement than probably ever before. Guilt is quite a big issue in determining people's attitudes and what they expect other people's attitudes should be. There's a lot of indignation and there's a lot of unease. Where did all that come from? Was it predictable? I don't know, but I would have said that there's, looking back from when we started in 1989, a lot of those things are quite surprising and weren't really expected. So it's put to me occasionally, well, what is actually driving the changes in people's choices and behaviour? And the latest persuasive argument seems to be good for the moment. This is to do with viral attitudes and celebrity statements and campaigns and pressures. And it does look as though for a time an argument takes over and then maybe doesn't last, but at the time it's very, very important. And that brings me on to the concept of memes. Next. I don't know whether you know about it, but I'm quite a fan of the work of Richard Dawkins, the scientist, who looked into not only genetic change, but also collective change in the whole population, not just individuals, and came up with the concept of a meme, which loosely is a unit of cultural transmission, imitation or replication. And that is sometimes a good explanation of these waves of attitudes and behavioural patterns that suddenly take over. Next. I can't tell you what the memes are, but if you look backwards, I think you'll see how significant they can be over the years. Sometimes there's a behavioural pressure on the whole of society, which sort of creates a zeitgeist, and sometimes some kind of zeitgeist arrives and dictates behaviour. But once it's happening, it's very difficult to resist it. Just my second hypothesis, that chaos is not chaotic. Of course, it looks chaotic, but something's usually happening that is impossible to spot and then suddenly becomes clear when the dust settles. One of the examples is random convergence. Just a quick example, everybody knows: a pandemic, a lockdown, digital imaging technology available, and a sense of isolation. Whoosh, Zoom takes over the world. Peter mentioned it, I think, earlier to me, that he was working on teleconferencing back in the 1970s. It didn't really take off. It has now, and that has enormous knock-on implications for the transport sector. Example 2, phone, unique identity system, automated banking, and the cult of immediacy. What do we get? Mobile payments, personal money management online. Cash is no longer king, and all transactions are trackable, which in its own way has a huge implication for the way we run our society and what people do. So my conclusion, no one invented some of these combinations or planned for them, but they become the new normal, but the new normal doesn't last long. So watch out for the next meme or the next collision of technologies and circumstances. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Peter. You've opened up a lot of new territory there. So let's have 2 more presentations and then get on to the discussion. I'm going to introduce Llewellyn Morgan. Llewellyn's Head of Innovation at Oxfordshire County Council.
I found my my slides, so I'm going to attempt to share.
Excellent.
Hopefully you can see that, can you?
Yes.
So yeah, we were given the challenge a couple of years ago by the NIC to look at what the last mile solutions of Oxfordshire would look like for 2030, 2031 and 2050. So I'm going to sort of use them as a base to talk around. But one of the things we did do is look at the 50 years of transport in Oxfordshire. So it's always, this is a nice slide that we use to put up, but it was interesting in that, well, I think lots of things have changed. I don't think some things have changed in terms of what we're looking at. And the focus is, in Oxford has always been driven about how you make the centre of Oxford better, a better place to be in. And it's quite often been driven by different types of traffic. I mean, the amount of traffic in the centre helped drive park and rides. And then we had pedestrianisation. And then more recently, we've looked at shared space concepts outside our train station, trying to make the place a better place to be in as well, and a better environment. So I think that continues now, although the solutions are sometimes less hard engineering. So for NIC, for 2031, we were looking at introducing these smart corridors, we were calling them. I mean, the thing to notice here was a much bigger focus on decent cycling infrastructure, supporting public transport priority. I mean, there was also a focus of demand management. So we were looking at, and we continue to look at, things like workplace parking levy or even congestion charge to try and reduce the amount of car trips into the centre of Oxford, make public transport reliable, and make it much better environment to cycle and walk around. But also in this, we started to recognise that use of digital technology is going to be an opportunity. So that gives us a big opportunity both in looking at sort of dynamic management of the network, but also much better information to users. So you can start to encourage users to use your network in a different way. We also, in this, just partly to wind up the bus companies, it wasn't really there, it seemed to, we suggested, one of the big issues with Oxford, when you talk to people, it's about turning a bus around. So we thought, well, why design a city around a 10-ton bus? Why don't we redesign the 10-ton bus so it fits the city? So we came up with a reversible bus, which everyone told us is impossible. They do have them I've been on one in France, so they do exist already. But the idea here is you could really clear the centre of Oxford, but have a sort of a bus system that works more like a rail system, I suppose, to some extent. And we know with electric drivetrains, it's actually quite easy. It's relatively easy to do. It does have lots of implications in terms of the way bus operations work, the way that they pass the buses off down to other parts of the network. But it was an interesting challenge to people, and the public liked it. So that was something that we came up with. It was relatively simple that you could do now, if you could make the commercials work. In 2050, we sort of we extended the idea of freeing up the space in the centre. So we looked at something that we called the micro metro, and we looked at this jointly with Cambridge and Milton Keynes. And the idea here was tunnelling. So this was looking at tunnelling, narrow-bore tunnelling that was cheaper to do. Not a million miles away from some of the concepts that Elon Musk has used for the Boring Company in terms of the engineering principles, but a very different principle in terms of what you put in the tunnel, because it was definitely public transport. And we also put forward to government that maybe you could look at this in a different way. So instead of the commercials behind this did not have to just be around a return on fare box and public transport. This is more around, as a UK, if we developed a solution, you then export that. So you use somewhere like Oxford and Cambridge as the window to a business opportunity. So you drive in different types of investment to the solution. And it was interesting, it challenged people. I still think we should look at this a bit. But I would say in the last 2 years, and even with COVID more recently, with the challenges of how we move people around, and also the opportunities for using different types of conferencing and virtual working. And I think potentially maybe we can look at more simple solutions. So I still think we should look at this, and I encourage that we should look at this more, because I think things will change again. But I'm more veering now towards just having simple solutions like cycle superhighways. I think most of the things I've learned from doing technology projects is technology enables things. One of the best things we've been able to look at is get better data about how the cities work. And what you can do with that data is actually make simple things happen. So maybe if we can understand the way the city works well, that's where that allows us to sort of manage it better, and where we can prioritize cycling and walking. And if you talk to people, that seems to be what they want. So when we did the Citizens Assembly with the City Council, that was really interesting. That came out sort of in a big way, that they just want a better place to cycle and walk around and be in. Or maybe we should try and deliver that. And there's ways of doing that quite sort of in the next 10 years, not having to wait till 2050. But I think if we learn from places like Copenhagen and Holland, we know that it's taken 30 years to get to where they are. So maybe it might take that long. But you need to start now. So I think, I don't know how remote work is going to play out at the moment. Just as a bit of context for everyone, our core corridors into Oxford are running at anywhere between 40% lower levels of traffic and 30%, depending on which corridor it is. It's about 25 to 30% across the county as well, at a lower level. If that continues, then it opens up a whole new raft of opportunities. And one of them is probably the more sustainable opportunities of making our towns a better place to be. And then the big challenge is going to be on the places themselves, because, you know, you've seen Barclays announce that they're talking about closing down major city centre offices, and even talking about putting the workers out into some of the banks that they still own in towns and cities. Now that's going to be potentially good for some of the small towns, but not good for the big cities if lots of businesses do move out. And you've even seen those challenges from Silicon Valley. I think it's ironic that the technology that Silicon Valley invented has not been used properly in Silicon Valley until the pandemic came along, which seems odd, but that seems to be a big discussion in that area at the moment, because they also have a massive problems with transport and cost of housing. So if you can live anywhere but still work for a company, why wouldn't you? So yeah, the urbanisation and the increasing in urbanisation is going to be the big challenge for society, I think, and I'm not sure what that's going to look like, but I think it's going to look have fundamental changes to the places that we live in. I think that's about it.
Llewellyn, thanks. Great presentation. Finally, Nicola Kane. Nicola is Head of Strategic Planning, Insight and Innovation at Transport for Greater Manchester.
Thanks, Andrew. I don't have any slides. I'm a fairly late addition to the panel, so I'm going to talk a bit about my experience, and I guess this has been tested quite a lot over the last couple of months in planning long term for an uncertain future. And I've spoken about some of these things at other events, but I thought I'd maybe reflect a bit about having sort of faced being in the middle of a crisis, which has probably really sort of challenged some of our long-term plans, how we're responding to that, and how we're sort of trying to adapt them to be robust in the future. So I guess the first point to make, and it's an obvious one, has probably already been made today, but I think it's important to recognise that the future isn't inherently uncertain. I think as transport professionals, we've perhaps tried to apply a spurious level of certainty to the future in building business cases and investment plans. And I think the experience of the last 3 months has shown that's fundamentally flawed. We don't know what's coming. We don't know what the future holds, and we need to make sure that we can plan for the future, but we can do so in a way that that is robust to a range of different scenarios. So for me, that brings us back to the point that we do need to have highly flexible, highly adaptable plans and proposals. We don't know what's on the horizon, but that's not an excuse for not doing the right planning and the right long-term thinking. So in Greater Manchester, the way we've done that, and again, I've spoken about this before, but we very much start with that clarity of vision. And for us, that's really about creating a sustainable, inclusive sort of economy for the future, tackling the major environmental challenges, climate emergency, creating a better city to live and spend time in. And we've articulated that in a bit more detail now through what we've called the right mix, which is looking at what mix of modes are we aiming for different sorts of journeys, from those local neighbourhood trips to travel into the city centre, and other journeys to towns and other places across the conurbation. So that started to articulate that vision in a bit more detail. And then we very much embraced a range of tools, things like scenario planning, which we used in developing our long-term plans, but we have now really come to the fore, and we've developed some post-COVID scenarios that we've been using to test our plans for robustness, and that's really helped to focus people's minds that there are again a range of post-COVID scenarios. None of that's certain. Some of that we'll be able to influence. Some of that we'll need to be put ourselves in the best position to respond to. But those kind of tools are, I think, are incredibly powerful and useful in having a sort of shared conversation about what the future might hold. We also do a lot of horizon scanning. So, for example, we're members of the European Policy Network and other international networks where we can start to see what's happening elsewhere and use that to kind of inform what might be coming, what might not be a trend or an opportunity for Greater Manchester or the UK yet, but that might be on its way. So, obviously, now looking at things like e-scooters, looking at the experience of other towns and cities across the world, and whether that's the sort of technology that we want to think about adopting here. And then we've very much taken the approach of experimenting, so trying things out in the real world, and seeing what happens, seeing how people respond to them, see how they work in the context of the place that we're planning for, recognizing that everywhere is different, has a different context, has different requirements, different populations. So being able to try things out in the local place and then adapting your plans accordingly. And then I think the sort of final point I think is really about talking to people, engaging with people, understanding what people's aspirations are, what their needs are, and doing that on a regular basis, so that we can start to see how people's needs might be changing over time, how different groups' requirements in different places might be changing over time, and keeping that dialogue going, really. And again, through this crisis, our research team was quick to get a travel survey up and running. We surveyed about 14,500 people in Greater Manchester to ask them about their experience of being in lockdown, how their travel had changed, and how they saw that playing out as we come out of lockdown, which has given us some really rich information about what people are thinking and feeling, and what their travel aspirations might be. So sort of just bringing that all together in terms of, so what, I guess bringing it back to the current situation around COVID-19 and what the future might hold. We're trying to put ourselves in the best possible place to test our plans for robustness against different future scenarios. I think there's a whole range of challenges on the horizon that we need to grapple with, some of which we've touched on today. So I think for me, home working and also the future of business travel is that's been massively disruptive, and I think that will have a long-term impact on travel requirements. Although I suspect some of that business and commuter travel may well be replaced by other sorts of travel. So looking at sort of leisure and off-peak trips, and how can we create a transport system that's more responsive to those diverse needs. I guess the other really big challenge we're now facing is how do we simultaneously tackle an economic crisis and rebuild the economy in Greater Manchester, whilst also tackling a climate crisis. And I think that's an issue which will continue to sort of exercise our minds for some time to come. And how do we work in a collaborative way across different policy areas to deal with those two crises simultaneously. And then finally, I think sort of looking at attitudes to different modes and how the current crisis has maybe influenced that. So we've seen a lot of talk about an active travel revolution. I think we've definitely seen some of that here. How much of that is people walking and cycling more for leisure? I'm not sure, but there's certainly a trend where people are looking to spend more time in their local area. And I think that's going to be really positive for local neighbourhoods, for people I guess seeing the value of their local area and also for local towns. So we're sort of trying to understand what that means. And then on the flip side, looking at the impact on public transport and how we rebuild confidence in that. And again, that sort of tests some of our future plans around public transport investment and how do we respond to that. So I think that's all I wanted to say for now, Andrew. But happy to sort of pick up questions and through the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nicola. And yeah, I think we might certainly. I had one question, but we'll see how things we'll see how things with the discussion develop, and we'll come back to you on that one. Thank you. So look, the chat facility is open to anyone who's got questions. Please put them on. There's not a huge number of questions I can see there at the moment. Richard Talbot, though, Richard, you had a point here about the something that. Was raised at the start by Chris, didn't you? Do you want to just come in on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just closing the door, noisy. The slide that Chris showed that showed a modular building, colourful modular building being craned into place on the site of what used to be an old swimming pool is a really interesting point about housing. So it's very good in one sense that it's quite cheap to build, and obviously housing is really needed. But there was a whole series of retail tenancies on the ground floor that were supposed to be community orientated, and they're completely empty. And that was way before COVID, and have proved unlettable just because of their location. And I think that for me sparked off a thought about the collapse of the commercial property market with all of the changes in behaviour that we're going to be seeing. And so rather than all the garden villages that I'm hearing about, shouldn't we be converting commercial property to residential in towns and cities and bringing presence back to high streets in the form of residents, which might then help to rebuild some of our failing high street economy?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. The whole land use impact of COVID seems to be a growing area of discussion. I'm picking up anyway. We had on the front page last issue about Transport for London reviewing all their office accommodation. We had their suggestion that people would be living and working from home more, which would perhaps reduce in commuting into central London, but boost the economies of local neighbourhoods. We heard Llewellyn talking about Barclays reviewing their major offices. The Norfolk County Council, I was reading this week, they're promoting they're seeing COVID as an opportunity to promote Norfolk as a place to live for people who really no longer have to work every day in London anymore. And the suggestion Norfolk's making is people will increasingly want to have a nice house with a garden when they're working from home, and they'll want to be near a train station where they can get a train into their office maybe once a week rather than every day, so they can live a lot further away from where they work. So there's a huge host of dynamics going on the kind of land use front, which would be interesting to see how they play out. I don't know if anyone's got any views on that they want to share, put their hand up or raise a question, but it seems to be a potential dynamic we might see. I'm going to go Nicola. Can I ask you? Yeah, Nicola, I don't know whether your scenario planning was post-COVID was looking at land use patterns as well as, more travel demand patterns. Can you say a bit about those issues?
Yeah, we've sort of thought about it indirectly in the first instance. So the scenarios we've constructed look at how quickly we recover from COVID crisis and how quickly the economy recovers against kind of changing attitudes, attitudes to things like the environment, technology, people living more locally. So it's kind of in there in the attitudinal stuff, but not directly. Although we have had a lot of conversations about that. And I think the interesting thing, I think Luella mentioned this about towns. I think there's kind of an opportunity there around towns. We've got we've got a number of towns which have struggled over recent years. Some of which have been starting to make a good recovery, but I think people are starting to really value their local area, and I think having more people. It was already on our agenda, but having more people living in and around town seems to be a good opportunity where you get the best of both worlds. Where, as you say, you've got good access to a public transport hub, a rail station, or a Metrolink station. But you've also got good local facilities on your doorstep that you can walk and cycle to. And the travel survey we did certainly said that people were planning. I mean, whether people will continue to do this longer term remains to be seen. But we're intending to continue to do their food shopping, for example, more locally and do it on foot and by bike. So I think that there is some kind of opportunity there that I think we need to see if we can build on.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because people up before until COVID had kind of written off the high street. The high street was dead, and maybe the forces are now going towards it.
Yeah, and I think it'll be a very different looking high street, won't it? With much more kind of independent shops, things that you can't get elsewhere, things you can't get easily online, shops, restaurants, and bars. Cinemas, those sorts of things are the things that are coming back into some of our local towns. But that has to be driven as well by more people living within easy walking distance of those towns. So there is definitely a land use dimension to that.
Okay, thanks. I saw Peter Hedekar. Peter, you've got something to say.
I wanted to query what you were saying, Andrew, about Norfolk.
Yeah.
Ask whether there's any sight of anything similar in a non-metropolitan, non-London orientated region. Because I think the whole business about land use change at a strategic level, and this business about working and commuting and so on, what goes on in relation to London and the distance over which its influence applies, and in commuting and how often and where people live and so on, is on a completely different geographical scale, I think, to what goes on in any of the provincial conurbations. But I may be wrong. I mean, I just want to ask Nicola whether she sees anything in what the sort of thing that Andrew's just been saying, or whether you're dealing with a much more geographically localized land use redistribution, if it or population redistribution.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit. I think it's too early to say, really. But we've seen a huge amount of growth in the sort of inner urban area over the last 10 years, and we're certainly planning for that growth to continue. But I think we're going to have to put even more emphasis on making sure that those sort of densely populated urban areas have got the right level of green space and so on, and are attractive places to live. And I think certainly the experience of the last couple of months has shown that that needs to be a really high priority, and we can't just keep putting it more and more housing in without having those facilities. So I think that'll be some of the debate going forward. But I think it's certainly one that we're going to be watching very closely in terms of people's attitudes and whether they do look to move, whether there's a reversal of that trend of moving back into the city.
Okay, Peter Stonham, you'd like to say something?
Yeah, I just want to throw in one of my kind of let's think about it in a different way points. Take housing. Things that occur to me. First of all, is the housing provision, finance and ownership model correct? I mean, couldn't that change radically? For instance, how you finance your home, the cost of moving home, the sort of sticky investment that we created for home ownership, its approach as an asset collection, and then there's an issue of family size change, behaviour change. Do the new Barrett and Persimmon homes bear in mind all this about working from home and everything? And is the 2 up, 2 down kind of approach right? And then finally, I think there's an issue emerging, and I can imagine someone climbing on board it. Could we please be able to pick our neighbours? In other words, when I'm buying a home, I mean, I've got a location decision, I've got a unit size and layout decision, but I've also got a neighbour decision. And I mean, I've been lucky, and I've had 1 or 2 experiences in my life where I've been living next to people I'd rather not. I think that's going to become an issue for people. They want to be in a community of people who they like to be with and not be disrupted by random effects next door.
Right. What are you suggesting, that people kind of should declare their belief systems on their front door?
I'm not suggesting that they should do anything. I'm suggesting someone will want to intermediate in that market event, I think.
A housing consultant advisor. Yeah, okay. Below, Nicholas, I saw you want to raise something. Can you take yourself off mute, please? Just down the bottom left.
Yep, okay. Yes, I've just been taking part in an RTPI webinar where I was talking about learning from the Danes. And in Copenhagen, 40% of housing is co-housing. I think in Denmark as a whole, it's probably 16%. But basically cities, towns make themselves attractive because you're living not just as an independent person, but in a community in which you share some responsibility for looking after the public space. You have some shared facilities, perhaps eat with other people and so on. And this makes living at a higher density much more attractive. And in my view, is something that we really need to try out in the UK. It also makes life much more affordable, and people in countries like Denmark or Austria or whatever, Switzerland, have much more to spend on eating out and so on, because their housing costs are less as a proportion of their income. So that leads on to a proposition, which is that the really interesting areas, in my view, are not just town centres, but they're railway stations and junctions and the areas around stations, and their potential for being much more than just places to get on and off a train, but to be real interchanges where you can move easily from one mode to another, including obviously being able to leave your bicycle. You can see that the extreme in Holland. In terms of we're always being able to shop and so on. So I would be interested in other people's reactions to how we can make the most of the potential of the station as a place. There's some examples like Oxford where the station is disgraceful, and where there is lots of land around it. But it seems to me that nothing happens unless there is an organization that can take on the responsibility and pull all the funding together, like a development corporation. In no way can you just look to the railway operator or to even the owner of the railway assets to achieve what's required. So to my mind, the question is not speculating about the future, but saying, what kind of future do we want? What kind of place would we like to be like? Would we like to be like a city in Denmark or Holland or Germany, or indeed almost anywhere in Northern Europe?
Okay, let's open that. Let's see if anyone wants to take up on that discussion about essentially shaping the urban future and what we need to be doing on it. I might come, if no one puts up their hand, I'll come to, David Metz. David.
Yes, I think the problem is we inherit the built environment that's been developed over very many years, and it's really very difficult to change it. I mean, Nicholas mentions co-housing in Denmark. I'm involved in the attempt to develop a co-housing community in London, and it's very difficult because you inherit the built environment and the land patterns. Land is limited, the planning regime is a limiting factor. So I think we have to accept that we can change the built environment at the margin with new developments, but we really have got what we've got. And within that constraint, traveling faster gives you more access to all the things you want to get to. And I think this is relevant in the post-COVID situation with growing unemployment, and where people who are unemployed will look further afield or look to different possibilities. for where they might be employed. And this is where the car will be attractive to them, because basically for door-to-door travel over reasonable distances, the car is well suited, where you can park at both ends of the journey and where congestion isn't too severe. And the problem with encouraging people to move more slowly with active travel is it's slower, and therefore you reduce access. Now, in high density urban areas, that's not a problem. But more typically, I think the scope for shifting people to slower modes will be difficult, because you will be reducing access, not just for employment opportunities, but for all the other services we've got used to. So I suspect when we've come through the pandemic, things will have changed less than many of us would like to have seen change, because we're stuck with the built environment we've got, and we're constrained by that in terms of the opportunities we can gain.
David, do you feel that the travel patterns might become more complicated, less concentrated with in the aftermath of COVID? I'm particularly thinking, I guess, about commuting and business travel. If people are, I think you've said on the chat that people might have to go further to search for work. We might see the reduction in concentration of employment in town centres, or town and city centres, works against public transport as well.
So I think if you become unemployed, you look for employment, suitable to your abilities and skills, and the area in which you can seek that unemployment is determined by the speed at which you can travel. I mean, access goes up with the square of the speed of travel, because it's proportional to the area that you can get to, where the radius of the circle is proportional to the speed of travel. And this is what we've become used to over the years with the growth of car ownership and in urban areas of good public transport. If we were to revert to village communities where we would walk everywhere, which would be good in many ways, the range of opportunities open for employment, for schools, for services, all the other things, would be very, very limited. And I think this is the kind of most fundamental thing about the transport system operating in the built environment we've inherited, which, probably speaking, we value and don't want to radically change, and the lifestyles which we've grown up with over the years. So I'm quite cautious about predicting big changes, even though there's always a good argument that one can do things better.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I guess it's also always tempting to assume big changes when you're living in something like COVID. You think it's going to have huge impacts long term. There's a couple of hands being raised. John Austin. John, can you take yourself off mute, please?
Yep. Yeah, you got me now. A point that relates to both what Nicholas was saying and David is actually building interchange into the planning system in order to increase the flexibility of travel and actually make various forms of travel faster, which aren't at the moment because of poor interchange. And also perhaps as well making travel safer, because if one has interchanges which are planned, one's able to control the flow of people better in a pandemic or in the aftermath of a pandemic. But there was a question earlier in chat about who is going to plan centrally for interchanges. And that is something that still concerns me. I think that question is very relevant. We can see the need to put interchange as a functionality, if you like, and allow for that in the land use planning system. But who will actually do that? Who will take control of that? I think is a difficult question.
Okay. I keep looking at Keith Mitchell. I don't know, Keith, if you want to come in on this at all, but I kind of feel some of this discussion is up your street, as it were, on interchanges and housing integration. Do you have any thoughts on this? If you don't worry.
No. Good afternoon, Andrew. Very nice to see you.
Hi.
I was particularly struck by the discussion around getting some urgency about transforming our town centres into places where we can increase the amount of housing by repurposing retail and commercial space. There's no doubt in my mind that commercial business will be reducing their demands on central office space. We're doing so, others will be doing so. And it seems pretty certain that there's going to be a major restructuring of the need for central retail accommodation and very quickly moving across to other special forms of retailing, i.e. internet shopping and logistics. And that'll in itself bring pressure on edge of centre sites for last mile logistics connections. So there's a big land use change coming, no question. The question is how to come back to the point that I think virtually everybody has made, is what do we want that future to look like, and can we put the incentives in place that means that business and developers move in the right direction, not the wrong direction. And that's going to have to be pretty bold stuff, and it's not going to be laissez-faire, let it happen, because that's when you get 1,000 asylum seekers stuffed in an office building in Croydon, which doesn't help anybody.
Okay, yeah.
I'll leave it there, really. I think, I mean, just for me, that I know the ACE, the Association of Consulting and Engineering, is currently looking at this issue. My colleague Paul Riley is the president, so he's doing something on it, I know, today. But very specifically looking for suggestions of how you can incentivize the sort of land use changes that we can see coming, but to incentivize them in a direction that leads us towards net zero carbon and good social outcomes. And that's a real challenge, because government isn't going to make all of this happen unless it's incentivizing the right sort of behaviors. We can't rely on people to necessarily make the right choices, because we all make the choice as we see it, whether or not we see that as a selfish human choice or whether or not that's a choice we're making in our own circumstances. But we're not making those decisions on the basis of the overall good of the whole, generally speaking. So it's a matter of creating the conditions for all of those decisions to be made in the right direction. And that's a really tough call.
Okay, thank you. Peter Warman, I saw you were going to chip in something as well.
Yeah, I think, particularly in the current circumstances, we have to be interested in the short term, but there seems to be, and I think Nicola referred to this, a disconnect between what we do in the next 5 years and what the implications are for 20 plus years. So I think whatever we propose, whatever changes are happening, I think we have to have the systems that can test how would this relate to a future of 25 years' time where climate change has taken hold. And for instance, we may think we're all going to rely on broadband. Well, we will do if our electricity supply has resilience. Otherwise, we may be in a problem. And obviously, flooding can affect that. So I realize individuals can't do everything, but whatever is being proposed, can we please look at the implications for 20 to 30 years' time under the conditions which the Parliamentary Committee recently, they wrote their progress report, gives you 200 pages of some of the things that might be happening in that time. Anyway, I don't know how that affects, but it's this disconnect between short term and long term.
Yeah, that's good. What do people think about whether we're going to be a more mobile society over the next 20, 30 years, or whether we're going to be less mobile? Do people have any kind of thoughts on that? I mean, I guess my default assumption has been that as societies and technology develops, we end up traveling a lot more. But what do people have any thoughts on that? Llewellyn, and then Chris. We'll come to Chris. Llewellyn first.
I mean, so we've been looking at this a bit because we've been doing some work with Bev Hindle for the ARC area.
Oh yeah.
Some of it's just looking at how do you think about what the future might look like, and then build that into what we might want at Oxford, Cambridge ARC area to be in the future. I think on the technology horizons, in terms of there's another wave of technology. What we're doing at the moment is taking advantage of technology that was essentially established 10 years ago in a pretty decent format. We've just got better infrastructure and generally better network support to allow it to work a bit better. But it's not a massive advance in terms of digital working, the remote working that we're doing at the moment compared to where we were 10 years ago, the stuff that is being worked on now will enable much more sort of augmented reality type meetings, which I think has the capability to reduce the need for a proportion of travel. I still think there's always going to be a decent amount of physical jobs. So I think at the moment, if you look at the travel to work at the moment, it's sort of settling that there's about a 20% to 30% increase in or decrease in the amount of commuting. But the rest, everyone else has got to go out and go and do their job. If you're working in a warehouse, you have to go to the warehouse. You can't do it remotely. So for the next sort of 5 to 10 years, I think there's going to be an increase in investment towards things that enable you to not have to travel. I don't think it's going to stop people's desire to travel, though. I think the big pressure is going to come from. The sad thing at the moment, personally, I think, is the biggest pressure to the biggest advance is about moving towards zero carbon and a sort of future that looks optimistic. It actually seems to be commercially driven because they're doing it because their customers want that. I think governments.
Who are doing what because their customers want?
Well, you recently had Coca-Cola announcing they're going for zero carbon. You've had a whole swathe. You've had even things like what's happened with Facebook, with all the companies coming off the advertising because they can see that their customers don't want them to do that and support this. I think we're in a world at the moment where consumers are driving the big brands to move quicker than any government, particularly Argo. Okay. And I think it's slightly sad. I'm glad something's happening, but it's pretty sad that I think we're sort of almost driven by big brands to move us forward because us as a general collective consumer want that. So it's I think there's definitely a role for government to be a bit more visionary and sort of allow us to have a trust in government again. I think. Okay,
I'm going to come to Peter Stonham, but I'm going to go to Christina, Chris Barrow first because she had indicated that she wanted to. So over to Chris.
Hello, hi. Yeah,
hi.
I'm editing a book for the Independent Transport Commission at the moment called Why Travel. Each chapter is by a different academic discipline. The gist of it is that there's something innately human about our need to move about and travel. And wearing another hat, I'm also involved with Heathrow and the Community Engagement Board there. And John Holland Kay, the Chief Executive of Heathrow, reckons that after lockdown, demand for air travel will be epic. And if you think about the carbon implications of that, that is quite a big thing. And is it possible that over the next 20, 30 years, particularly if I'm right about these multi-generational families, we will live locally, exist locally, but then have a massive demand for long distance air travel? We are already finding this phenomenon of shy flyers who are flying and don't like to admit they're doing it. So are we actually, if you like, coming up with a completely different scenario? All the things people are saying about local travel and city centres and so on may well be true, but the actual balance will still be with rushing off all over the world for holidays and business and everything else.
Okay, but just one thought, I guess if they're intergenerational families, there won't be so many visits to families by plane or train or whatever.
That's right, local lockdown, but more distant travel.
Peter Stonham. Is he still there?
Yeah, so travel, derived demand, first lecture on my degree course, okay? So what derived from what? And it's quite a well-known list: work, school, shopping, leisure, business, VFR, just referred to by Christine, medical, health, a few more. Well, we can work down that list. We've talked about work, patterns, no longer commuting, school. They're already teaching kids at home sometimes now, and that might change further. Shopping, online, leisure, I'll leave to the end. Business, travel, we talked about. Medical health, doctors are now seeing people online with this lovely Zoom thing and the things like it. So come to VFR. That's the one, sorry, come to leisure. We have a human condition called restlessness, right? Wanderlust, or how's it going to be satisfied going forward? You're right to suggest there's a trade-off between lots of short journeys, one big trip, maybe doing things nearer to home that are quite radically different from being at home. You know, swinging in the trees, venture parks. I don't know, but what I'm thinking is we've got to go back to basics and say what makes up people's lives, and these elements are going to change. And as they change the transport side. So it's not transport first; it's transport last.
Yeah, but you're painting a picture of significant changes in demand and overall, aren't you?
In my career, the fixed journey time matrix, I think it was, that's the name, isn't it? Everybody travels about the same time, but different distances and different destinations. Now, I wonder whether that will stick forever. That's very interesting. It hasn't been, presumably hasn't been the same back to prehistoric times, and it might not be the same for intergalactic times, but at some point it might shift. But we've based our thinking on the fact that there's a finite amount of time and a finite amount of travel, and that's the combination we plan for.
Yeah. Richard Walker, you've written something in capital letters, which means you must be very irate and want to talk about it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Am I on video?
Yeah.
Oh right, I can't see myself. Yeah, I'm not very alright. I'm very feeling. I just feel like that. We've got to be a bit careful about complacency. I mean, what I kind of wanted to say was the travel is a derived demand is the issue. It derives from the economy. What is the economy doing? And I think David has said things like, oh well, there'll be a change. People, the central London office market might slow down, and people go and drive to work somewhere else. And I think we've got to ask the question. I think as transport planners and town planners, you often take the economy as a given, and the question like what is the economy doing? What jobs is the economy going to be able to provide is a massive question, and really needs to be the focus of a discussion like this. And the points I would just bring out are that COVID creates some massive pressures on the transport system because of social distancing, but it's also going to create an enormous economic depression, which we're already seeing the start of. And we don't have the automatic stabilizers that we used to have, so that people are going to be quite desperate for work, and I'm not sure that the jobs are going to be there, because a lot of the sort of micro employers are really going to struggle to be in business. So I think we just need to ask some questions about how we're going to survive. What is the route through the economic depression of the next couple of years, which will take down the business model for most commercial transport provision. And of course, the whole thing about the commercial property is I think there's a big issue that commercial property has been based on office jobs and the kind of leisure restaurants, bars type stuff that sort of clusters around it. And I think both of those are in big trouble. But I don't think they'll necessarily just reappear somewhere else. I think that the thing that we've got to think of is transport demand. As people get more disposable income, they tend to invest more in traveling places. And what's the plan for people having any rising disposable income over the next 5 to 10 years? I could see it dropping by quite a lot. So I think we just need to bear that in mind. And I'd be interested in people what to have to say. But to me, that's the most important issue, which has not really come up in the conversation so far. And I think it's partly, I'll finish with this one. There's always been a lot of complacency about London. London's been a jobs generating machine for the past 30 to 40 years. It's now completely detached from the rest of the British economy. So what happens to the financial sector in London is question one. What does the rest of the British economy do is question two. They're not necessarily that closely linked, but London and Londoners are already complacent that jobs will be there. The rest of the country, particularly sort of, you know, the north and stuff, that they have always been more worried about where do the jobs come from, where's the you know, where's the underlying demand that's going to underpin the system. So
okay,
anyway, I'll leave it at that.
does anyone want to come in on reaction to what Richard has just raised there, or any hands? I can't see on the second screen, but there may be. Well, we can come back to if that's the case. Llewellyn, you were raising the point about your, I think it was your daughter. I thought it was just a nice little anecdote for people to hear.
Oh yeah, it's just in relation to what Chris said. So when I asked my daughter, I asked my 7 and 10-year-old. So my 7-year-old gave a funnier answer about the future. He wants ice cream delivering drones, which I'll have to go and talk to one of our teams because they're doing a drone project. I don't think we've looked at the use case of ice cream delivery, but that's a good one. But my 10-year-old, I think she wants to, you know, to be able to cycle and have a better local environment, but she sort of assumes she'll be able to get anywhere in the world within a couple of hours. She assumes the technology by 2050. So she thinks, yeah, if I want to go to Brazil for the weekend, I'm going to Brazil, or, you know, and the technology will advance to allow it to do that. And it's interesting that it's just an assumption that I think they're living in a world where we've seen technology rapidly increasing and they just expect that to continue.
Yeah. What do you think of that suggestion?
Well, yeah, I think potentially, yes. If you look at some of so this is looking on the mass optimism. So let's not delve into riches. It's going to be a disaster for the next 10 years. Probably is. But let's look at, if you're looking at the investment going into space travel and trying to get to Mars, a byproduct of that may be an ability to get around the world quicker.
Yeah, I can see that.
Eventually you'll get it driven to a point that it's a cost that you can afford. The other question is, how do you do that with a low carbon impact? I mean, that's the big challenge, because none of that has a low carbon impact, but you could see it.
It doesn't seem implausible to me. I don't know how to do it. Yeah. Yes, Nicola.
So I was just going to come in. So talked about the importance of having a clear vision of where you want to get to, and I think we've talked about, there's a lot of rhetoric about build back better, but I haven't heard anyone really clearly articulate what a vision of a future green economy really looks like, and to actually really bring that to life. That's obviously not for us to do as transport planners in isolation, but I think we would have a big contribution to make to that kind of debate. Because I think unless you have that clarity of vision, then it's very hard, isn't it, to move towards it.
Well, all the talk is of having this green recovery, and at the moment I see the discussions focusing on kind of active travel and not wanting to encourage the car back. But are you saying that? I mean, but
it's coming back to that derived demand thing, isn't it? What are people going to be walking and cycling to? Where are the jobs going to be? What sort of jobs are they? And otherwise, you're having that debate in isolation of the actual journeys people are going to need to make.
Yeah. Okay, David Metz, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, a green economy will be an all-electric economy. We won't have any fossil fuels. Now, it will be difficult to do, but it's doable. But doesn't fundamentally change the structure of society, because you can heat your homes with electricity, you can run your cars with electricity. But going electric will go really quite a long way towards greenness, without changing the derived demand story about the need to travel. The key thing about travel is that it's always time constrained. I mean, we know from the National Travel Survey that average travel time has been about an hour a day, since we've been measuring it. So there's a constraint there, and we've achieved more access through traveling faster, but it's actually quite hard now to see how we would travel faster. I mean, space travel, yes, but where are you going to go to? I think we've really run out of ways of traveling faster through better technology. And interestingly, the one technology we haven't talked about today in the transport sector is automation, autonomous vehicles, driverless cars. A year or two ago, this must have been a big topic for thinking about the future, but it's really dropped out now. because it's going to be much more difficult to implement on existing road networks than people had thought. It's probably going to be a very expensive technology, and the benefits are really quite limited. That automation is not a solution to any of the problems we've been discussing today. So the future will be electric propulsion, electric energy, but it won't be an automated driving future, in my view.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to just have one final kind of area that I was aware we haven't kind of come back to, is the kind of attitudinal attitudes. The area that Peter Stonham covered in his presentation, which I thought was very interesting, and I hadn't expected it really to, to be part of this discussion initially, but I could see where he was coming from. Peter, can I just go to you? Do you think this is generational shift, or is it due to technology such as social media shift? And maybe if you just say, I don't know, a few words about how it connects to transport per se, in your views, what it makes harder or easier or whatever.
Well, I think the sad thing is it doesn't connect to transport per se. I mean, that's the big challenge for us. I mean, there's stuff going on which has got no logical connection to transport. In fact, there's some real serious disconnects. I've just said a chat round about Llewellyn's daughter. Is she a fan of Greta Thunberg for not flying, or is she a fan of Emma Thompson for flying from California to join the demo? I mean, there's so much irrationality about people's behavioural patterns and their rationale for them. I think that's back to my points about don't assume there's anything logical about any of this. It's all completely weird. And the bits that kick in for a little while, they're not weird at the moment because people are doing things and self-reinforcing their behaviour. Things go viral and everybody's saying the same thing for a week and then it changes. And I think the transport implications of that are very, very hard to grasp, to be honest, and I can't see exactly where it's going to land. The things that we've based our our planning and professional behaviour on are the danger points, because predict and provide was one, right? And then we got this travel time thing that David's just referred to, the hour a day and the distance relationship of extra travel being added in the same time frame. But if people do a lot of walking, they won't have any of that time left because they've spent it all getting to the shops. So I can't see the logic of any of this at the moment. And that's why I think this sort of explanation using the Dawkins mean model is more helpful than any of the technical and professional tools we've got at the moment.
Interesting. Nicholas, you've got something to say perhaps on that.
Yes, I went to, you can hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you, yep.
Yep, okay. I write a regular blog called Postcard from the Future whenever I go anywhere interesting. And I recently went back to the States 50 years on and went from Vancouver down to Palo Alto, back to Stanford, and went to see the offices of Facebook and Apple and Google. And what was very depressing was to see how appalling the quality of life was for so many people. With 10,000 people sleeping in the streets in San Francisco, the bus shelters being occupied by people living them. There are no longer any black people in San Francisco. They all have been kicked out, living several hours away, far away from any jobs. And people are taking 2 hours each way to get to work, or living in camper vans I saw in Palo Alto. So the future can be very bleak. It may be great if you're Musk perhaps, or Zuckerman, but it can be rather poor for many other people. So I do think if we are going to talk seriously, and we should be talking seriously about the future, we should first of all ask ourselves, what kind of people are we? Are we young, old, rich, poor, what race, and so on? And secondly, we should be asking, what type of world are we living in? And I would reiterate the point that you can see the future everywhere. As William Gibson says, it's just not evenly distributed. And you just have to look at many types of place, and particularly places that are comparable. So, for example, looking at Oxford, I look at Grenoble and Freiburg and other university towns to see what kind of place Oxford might be if it developed down a particular way. And so I'd like to think that though there will be surprises, We can also draw some lessons from other places elsewhere in the world, including places where people are much happier and use rather less resources than we seem to do in the UK these days.
How many people here are optimistic about the future? How many people are pessimistic about the future?
and I would say it could go either way. That we really do have the opportunity to create a much better future if we seize the current crisis. There's a rather good book I'm reading at the moment called about The Leveler by Austrian who's at Stanford. And he says that change only towards equality only happens after epidemics, wars, revolutions, and there's something else. But it doesn't happen through calm thinking, as you might think. We have at least had an epidemic. We may soon have a war. And it's very interesting that the best changes in terms of equality came after the First and the Second World Wars. But it's a very expensive way about bringing about change. And I'd like to think that if we could just simply use the unused resources that we have already, which include underused railway lines, areas around railway stations, lots of empty space in all our town centres, if we could just mobilize them and stop at the trend towards dispersal or sprawl, which is the most likely trend if we leave it to the market, we might actually have a better world. I just cannot work out whether we will go one way or the other. But Jared Diamond, who's written a very good book on collapse, when he was interviewed on Newsnight, said he was now much more optimistic as a result of the coronavirus epidemic than he was, because it's shown that people to some extent can work together. So I'd like to think this epidemic has been a good rehearsal for the climate change crisis, which is the real crisis, and of course the economic crisis, which is soon to catch up with us, and that we will actually find new ways of collaborating. The question is whether we have leaders in people like Johnson and Trump and Putin and so on, who have any capacity to respond to what I've just been saying.
Does anyone else have any who put their hand up either way? Does anyone want to say anything? Llewellyn, I was surprised at you being negative about the future. You're an innovator. You're the future. You've seen the future.
I change each day, so it depends what day.
We're coming back to you tomorrow.
Tomorrow is more optimistic. I do think there's a change, and I do think you can see people working together. So I think there's an opportunity, but I do think I have a political negativity. I have a belief in people, but not in the people who govern us.
Yeah.
Well, look, it's 3:29 and 44 seconds by my watch. So I think we always try to really bring these to a formal close at 3:30, and then it can carry on a little bit more informally afterwards if people want to. I didn't know where that discussion was going to go, and I have to say, of all the 7 that I've been involved in, this was the one I was looking at with a little bit of trepidation about just like, how would it be something we could actually grasp in the discussion? But it's actually surprised me. I've thought it's been good. You know, we've talked a lot about COVID, I think inevitably, and seen some of the possible medium-term implications on that. But you know, we all know that there's huge uncertainties about what impacts those will have, and it'd be interesting to follow through. But we've also touched on more fundamental kind of societal shaping matters. I always struggle slightly to summarize that into some brilliant master conclusion, but perhaps I'm going to hand back to Peter, and he might have something more profound to say. But thanks to all the participants today. I've really enjoyed that. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got nothing profound to say. I just like this. I must say, I do enjoy a discussion when we don't have a map and we're just exploring. And I don't think people are thread together out of what's been said today, but what you can do is some quite interesting bits and pieces of important stuff. I mean, if I take one thing away from today, it will be your double-ended bus, Llewellyn, because I mean, if I go back to my examples of these convergences of technology and situations, I mean, that's the most obvious thing in the world. You know, I mean, a tram is double-ended, for Christ's sake, so why isn't a bus? You know, it's crazy that hasn't been on the table before. I don't think Roger French is still with us from the 10% Club of Bus Operators, but I'm sure he'd be having a nightmare now about that. But I mean, can I ask Llewellyn, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here.
First of all, when did you put that on the table, and who knows about it, and what's been the response?
We put it up. It was 2018 that we presented that. It was actually it was an idea. From going on the double-ended bus in France. So there is a couple that exist both in France, I think they are. But anyway, they were bespoke built out there. But we talked to Arrival, who are one of our electric innovative companies. They're building a new electric bus, and what you realise is electric allows you to do a lot more easier things. So a diesel-driven bus, it's a bit more complicated.
Very complicated.
But with electric bus, they were like, yeah, it would be easy. So you were like, oh, let's put it in. So we put it in, and the designers who helped do the video came up with the sort of concept art design, which actually was quite cool. So we put it in as it's more of a push to think around the problem. It is crazy. You know, when we were going through some of the questions of Oxford, we were literally designing Oxford around a bus. And it's like, that's the wrong way around. When you could change the bus, it's just, you know, we're making, so the whole thing I've always said is, you know, we were literally, how do you turn a 10-ton bus? Well, what we're doing is actually removing the problem. All you have to do is get the driver to go from one end to the other.
Llewellyn, I think you're really onto something. Have you patented it?
No.
Oh, well,
I'm not sure I can patent it.
I'm going online at the end and getting that. But I'm a fan now, and I think we should play with that idea and test it. I mean, I've not been at the beginning of Facebook, and I've not been at the beginning of Zoom, and I've not been at the beginning of cashless payments and all that. But, you know, this is a nice little case study. If you took that away from today and said, okay, well, that might be one of the things that I've been trying to describe. And if so, how long is it going to take? What are the circumstances got to be? Who's going to invest in it? It's a lovely little cameo project to follow and test.
I would say it's an opportunity as the bus world becomes less commercial and the public sector have to do something. There's an opportunity for each town to build their systems, including the vehicles around their town. The problem is at the moment is the buses have to go through so many towns because that's the commercial model of bus companies.
Yeah, so, but that might happen if the public sector takes over buses. Well, yeah. We might have conductors back next week.
Yeah, why not?
I don't think you can call these the way these things play out. That's my big point. You can't. There's no model for how they're going to go through into reality or otherwise. You know? Anyway, can I bring anybody else in on the case study of the double-ended bus? Has anybody got a view on it? John Austin, you're in the bus market. What do you think?
It just makes me think of a tram, essentially. You know, that's what we used to have in cities until the 20s and 30s in this country and many others.
And which we have in every European city, virtually, that's of any significance.
So here's a takeaway from this. Why are trams better than buses? Because you don't have to turn them round. Right? That nothing to do with the electric power, nothing to do with the design of the vehicle, nothing to do with the tracks. It's all to do with the fact that you don't have to turn them round.
There are many other factors.
I know there are, but what I'm saying is that has never been pointed out in any report I've ever read. We need trams because they don't have to turn around. Have you read that anywhere, Nick? It's an important point that Llewellyn's made. Right, okay. Anything else people would like to discuss in the pub with me now? Oh, no one. Peter Warman, you're still here.
Yeah.
You like this kind of conversation, don't you?
I do enjoy it, yes. Do we take any more interest in devolution and trying to have effective local government, particularly unity? I think this is a fundamental problem because not only is the public confused of who to go to, but I do think there are competing interests, certainly whether it's two-tier between counties and local districts. Also, you can see the competition between the mayors and the government. So I really think we've got to get our organisations much more efficient and more unitary representation. And then there's very convenient partnerships can occur. The professionals can partner with other areas, but it's too many layers of politicians, I think, that is the problem. But do we think that as a country we're not devolved enough, and is this part of our challenge?
Can I make a plea not to restructure the whole of government, that would be a good idea, but to reinvent the Development Corporation, which was used quite successfully in areas like London Docklands, where, if you recall, they pioneered the Docklands Light Railway, a driverless train system, and they just did it using the viaduct that already existed, even though the Department of Transport was completely opposed to it, and Reg Ward nearly got sacked as a result. So it seems to me that if we said that there are certain situations which justify experiment, we'll use the Development Corporation vehicle because we can then capture the uplift in land values that comes when you bring development to an area where land is underused. We could learn from Denmark, where they have public asset corporations which pool all the public land and which are joint ventures between the municipality and central government. And in a sense, we can cobble together a much better future than we have at the present time. All it requires us to do is to get on the bus or train or plane and to go and look at a few other places and ask ourselves why we don't do it that way. And if we did it, would it be an answer to the problem?
Can I come in and reply to Nick on that one?
You could. You're going to take the whole of that point, or other things.
On Nick.
Good point.
I'll come back on something else. Go with that quick response then, Richard.
I was just going to ask Nick, do you detect any political appetites for that solution from what you know of the current administration? Because I think the Development Corporation is overdue a return to the scene, but I don't know whether there's anybody who's running the place who's thinking along those lines.
Well, remember that under Mrs. Thatcher, Michael Heseltine brought in development corporations for Docklands. I remember him going down there and saying nothing was happening. It was completely untrue. Things were happening. But it required somebody with his degree of authority to actually get it through. I think that there have been all sorts of optimistic signs from Conservatives, dare I say it, like Nick Bowles or Oliver Letwin, who've all gone to Freiburg. And I reiterate my point. If you go somewhere which has just done the sorts of things we all think are needed, like Freiburg, and if you can show that it pays off, that you, in the case of Copenhagen, you can fund a whole metro out of land value uplift, then it seems to me it's common sense, not communism, to actually follow that sort of approach. And if you then say there are certain places which justify experiment, you know, they've been messing about long enough, and I would say Oxford is one of those. Cambridge does seem to be rather more organized, but if one then says it's too important to just let it to chance, let us try something out, starting with the places where, if you like, the challenges are greatest, but the opportunities also greatest, like the area around the railway station. That's the way it was done in Denmark. They started with Orestad, then using military land, then they extended it to Portland and so on and so forth. It's a sort of, not an ideological approach, but an incremental approach, a pragmatic approach, if you like, where you do things one step at a time. You don't have the future completely mapped out. I always say, how do you eat an elephant? Answer, a bite at a time. You have a balanced incremental development approach. And then it seems to me it's common sense. Now, whether people like Johnson will buy it, I don't know, but he likes big ideas. He likes to see something happen. And most of the people in government have been to Oxford. So I'd say have a try that.
They are talking about development corporations for the Arc, aren't they?
Well, in Cambridge, 4 have been proposed in the last budget, if you recall, but nothing was proposed for Oxford. The key to it is it just requires 1 or 2 local authorities who could start with the county saying, we want to do this. Because when I discussed it with a Tory minister, he said, you've got to show that there's some local authority support, because there's a sort of grudging respect for democracy still.
I would say, having worked in Northamptonshire and working with West Northampton Development Corporation, that didn't do much. It was a good example of where they don't work.
Yes.
If anything, we managed to get more done in North Northamptonshire, which had a supporting body and not an authoritative body, than we did in West Northamptonshire.
Yeah, and Bristol is another example of where it was a complete failure. So you're right, unless you can set up the body with a support from the existing authorities, if you're opposed by them, you will get nowhere. It will be worse than doing nothing. So it requires a lot of diplomacy, and it requires people to discuss these ideas. But in my view, rather than talking in general terms, we should just be saying, let's have some experimental areas. I put forward a series of proposals for what we call land assembly zones based upon what the French do and so on. And it just requires a certain humility to try something out.
You've had a good go. I mean,
sorry.
Why all you grand designers and big thinkers, Chris, you're still with us. Can I embrace the social scientist's perspective again? Which form of democracy makes people happiest?
I think there's a great British tendency to go for the Burkean approach, that you elect someone and expect them to get on with it. So my message from today really is that transport profession is a little bit too insular. You need to get out there and see what's going on beyond your horizon. We're not very good at doing that. So I'm arranging to meet Richard Walker for a drink in the pub, and I think we should all relate to each other socially. So thanks for setting it up. I've got to go now. Bye.
Bye-bye. I think what I'm thinking is my business model of having these events is being killed by the pubs reopening. Business model was ushered in by the pubs closing, and now it's going to be ushered out by the pubs.
Bye.
Bye, Chris.
Right, now I think we're down to a couple of mates now, Richard. What's the number?
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got to go as well, I'm afraid.
Good to have you, John. Yeah, I think it's just friends and family now. We're just a household.
Tim has not said anything yet.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me along. Bye then.
Thanks for coming, Nick. Right. So I think I'm going to wind this up now, or wind you up or something. But it's been great, and it was not a pattern, it was a mosaic, but there's some wonderful fragments in there, both grand and small and long and short term, and I think it will inform my thinking going forward. I'm just off to catch a bus, but I can't decide which end to get on. That's the problem. Right, thanks a lot, guys. We'll be back, pubs permitting, in a fortnight. Thanks for coming, and thanks to the speakers who are still here for speaking.